All right, so as noted, I'm basically going over at the moment my dissertation or thesis rather that I did 2 decades ago, and covering off many aspects of theology as part of the philosophical aspect that we're discussing. So I'm doing chapter by chapter at the moment, as you should all know. And in this, we're now looking at the Judaic. So moved into the Greco-Roman last time, and now we're going into sort of pre-Christianity, although of course I still touch that all over the place. So if we think about Eve, again, there are many aspects of Eve as a sort of foundation for culture, and again, it's a legend, it's a story, but it's also a way of teaching and instructing. So, like all mythology, whether it's in part of religion or otherwise, there is some underlying story behind it. So when we're talking about Eve, we're talking about a story that has fairly much existed across multiple cultures, not just the traditional Abrahamic religions, but as we noted, very similar sort of approach in the first female from other cultures, including the Greco-Roman, the Babylonian, even Persian. So continuing with this, let's go into it. And looking at going into the introduction, we have Eve, once again, the first woman, but not the first man. Really comes down to a follow-up from the Ha Adam, or human, which created from the earth. The Ha indicates when Adam is not a personal name. It's so this is something that gets differentiated and got lost within Christianity. The Ha Adam is not just Adam, the person, but Adam as humanity. So that's a interesting sort of way that the many Jewish texts sort of look at this. So there are no
Craig,
gender
Craig, could I
differential.
just ask it on that point? So could it be interpreted that rather than God creating Adam and Eve as two people, if you go back to that original translation, could it be read as saying, really God created humanity, um, rather than just these two specific people, and then the rest of the story is more like allegory or something like that?
Both. I mean, there are different
Okay.
ways of doing it.
Right.
And in Jewish tradition, Eve as the first woman is mother of all humanity. So
Right.
her
Okay.
story continues not just as that, but the mother and father of the human race, so to speak. And if we look genetically, humanity nearly ended. There were actually periods in history where we know that there were less than 1,000 Homo sapiens sapiens around,
Mm-hmm.
meaning that there was sort of a very small potential not us period of development. So another aspect here to note is throughout most of the story in the Jewish text, there is no differentiation between gender. It just talks about people. So um, on top of that, ish, male, and the female isha, um, are basically created from Adam simultaneously. So an interesting aspect of this, if you take certain readings, especially Kabbalic ones, etc., what you start to notice is that male and female developed in a similar way to the Greek legends, where they were split apart. So, I mean, it's sort of strange to think that you take the rib out and then you take the female side of Adam, but in some interpretations of Jewish literature, you actually have the simultaneous male and female until it's split apart. So biblical humans then aren't separate from creation, but are connected to it. At this point, in many ways, we're like an animal. We're something connected to not just the Garden of Eden, but as an animal would be. We don't have that sense of different, alternative, out there, something elseness. So, I mean, this is part of the change. So, looking at our Eve legend, um, we have the typical biblical story there, like God, Adam and Eve wrapping themselves up to escape. But we also know much more than we did in the past. The Apocryphon, I'm not even going to pronounce that terribly well, which is from the Dead Sea Scrolls. Um, there are multiple ways of looking at this. We have it both as a temptation and sin sort of reference, and also emphasizing the role of free will. So free will is very important throughout sort of the Judaic and Christian sort of foundation of society. It's very different from that of the Greco-Roman and even other aspects of, well, where we are in the world. The stories here change and bring us apart from fates. So unlike the alternatives, this really sets the motion in play of we have a right to even go against what God says, which is very different to how it works in many other forms of religion, where the fates, you just, it'll happen. So the Hebrew Bible is, of course, the most well known. Um, and in this, Garden of Eden is a typical story that most of us would have heard, of course. I can't say everyone, but it represents the same sort of humanity and fall of humanity as we see in other cultures, whether they're Sumerian, Babylonian, Egyptian, etc. There are a lot of similarities at this point, but the interpretation is very different. So we have the serpent tempting Eve. This in uh, in Genesis is very quick, but imagine now extending this. So in the Dead Sea Scrolls, we hear about not Eve going, oh, yes, that's a nice apple, but the serpent tempting Eve over days before she finally goes, yeah, I'll try it. So the serpent uses many arguments, goes through all different comments, not just the simple version we see within the Old Testament and the Bible. The serpent flatters Eve. He then gives her logical arguments, um, and tells her about how if she doesn't, she will never be something more. That God put this here not just to test her, but to make you something more. So these arguments have actually developed over time, allowing for a more nuanced approach to how to understand all of this. So um, now, Hebrew, of course, is a Semitic language, and it's still in use today. So you can still learn all of this, although, like ancient Greek to modern Greek, it's very different. But all of these things change over time. So Hebrew is the official language of Israel, of course. So over time, the way that this has happened will change, but it's just because I mean, if you look at Latin itself, we think of it as a dead language and unchanging, but the works of scholars through different centuries will be very different. So that's part of what we need to look at. Now, um, this also has other more modern interpretations. Freud, for instance, not that I'm, from a psychological sort of perspective, very interested in Freud, but Freud brings up some very good philosophical points. He was looking at the psychological and sexual motivations in human behavior, and although he sort of probably was a little bit repressed and takes these things in a strange way, he makes some very good allegories against how Eve saw a decision to eat from the tree of knowledge, and how this may be the sexual awakening. If we think for a moment, we can see, well, the animalistic aspects of what existed before us being very different. There's no concept of rape or no concept of sort of feeling sin or anything like this in sexual behavior in animals. There is in humans. We have changed because of human consciousness. There's something awakened in us that made us different from everything else. So as we go through the various Jewish texts, Jubilee, 12 Patriarchs, etc., there are more nuanced interpretations of Adam and Eve, and these interpretations offer a different understanding. This is extended in Christian theologians. There's a typo in the slide, don't worry about that. So Augustine of Hippo, Thomas Aquinas, they then developed the concept of original sin. They took it and made it a deeper, nuanced idea that spread throughout Catholic thought. It became part of the concept of Christianity, and the original story of Adam and Eve developed because of the disobedience here, and it's become a central tenet of Christian thought and theological studies. Now, Israelite teaching, of course, emphasizes obeying God's commands and avoiding temptation. But at the same time, there isn't the depth of sort of avoidance of sin, of having built something bad. So, as you noted, Brendan, it's a very different aspect to the two religions. While the Christian religion changed with embracing the concept of original sin, and then the idea developed of salvation with Christ, the Jewish religion didn't ever develop this, and this is similar in some ways to Islamic religions, where it's more about, am I following the rules? So
Right.
It's actually interesting that there's a closer relationship between the Judaic and the Islamic religion because of that. Whereas we have the sort of now natural part of disobedience leading into a relationship that we have to build upon, knowing that we've done something wrong. I guess it's in a way we could be seen as a child that needs to learn. And
I feel
what we
like
need to, yeah,
I was just going to say, I feel like this is a really interesting difference between the religions, because with the idea of original sin, you grow up believing that there's always something that you've done wrong, and it kind of leaves the door open to doing more things wrong, rather than always being righteous. Because if you know that you can just go and ask forgiveness, that you will be forgiven for what you do wrong. Whereas in the other religions, it's about always trying to do the right thing. I feel like that there's a bit of it's sort of unbalanced there a little bit, almost, with the
well,
original
yes and
sin.
no. I mean, the difficulty there comes in the concept of grace.
Mm,
And in grace, it's not just, I'm forgiven, but it's actually, I want to be forgiven. I truly believe that I'm repentant. So if you don't believe that you're repentant, you don't get grace. So it's not
right.
the typical mafia bit where you go into court and go, I confess, I'm sorry I
Do
killed
your
that
Hail
guy.
Marys.
Can you be a bit quicker? I've got someone to bump off in 5 minutes. I mean, yeah, that, I mean, although it did sort of end up with the church embracing some of that with the sale of indulgences, etc. But unfortunately, that also led to the schism between like the Protestant and Catholic sort of faith, and the split of these different churches. So, by disobeying God, Adam and Eve introduced sin into the world where nothing existed beforehand. So, as an example, there isn't ever going to be the concept of sin as an animal. An animal can't sin. An animal can't do something wrong in the same way. They can be bad, they can, for us, I mean, but they're not bad in nature per se. They're neutral. I mean, a lion is just the lion because that's its nature. It doesn't have I mean, there's no concept of a good or bad something, even predator. It might be sort of something you don't want around, but it's not good or evil. It's not naturally evil. Now, that is actually very different to some of the concepts in other religions, including the Greek, where this was an evil. These evils of the world included these beasts, so to speak. Now, continuing here, Pandora, of course, created by the gods, as we already saw, contained all of the world's evils in one version of the story, Hesperod. She was warned never to open the box, but simultaneously we see a match between Judaic and Greek religions. Both times it's disobedience. You're told don't open the box, and she does. You're told don't eat the apple, and they do. Now, Eve submitted to the serpent. Curiosity got the better of old Pandora, but in each case, think of the world without having this happen. I mean, we can sit there going, wouldn't it be great if we were back there in a world before we had free will in a true sense? But yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think I prefer the fallen state better. It's a state where now we actually strive for something more and we have to work. So it's not just living as an animal and everything's given to us. So this really also gives us a cautionary tale in the Judaic about the dangers of disobedience that was taken up in Christianity to also put in the consequences of sin. So in these stories, what we're really looking at is integrating sort of the a way of how we can live in accordance with divine law, especially when some of those are conflicting. So as we're doing this, we need to also think about the philosophical traditions that have developed because of original sin. Now, they were given one commandment. This differs from what then developed over time. Post the flood story in the early biblical area, of course, Moses gets given 10 commandments. That, of course, is very different. Then we're making them more nuanced and we're going, don't do this, don't do this, don't do this. And yet we still manage to fail in all of those. Right at the story of Exodus, of course, stories of failures. He goes up to the mountain. What happens? Everyone goes, oh, let's build a golden calf. So disobedience is part of what we seem to do. Now, death is introduced to the world, but at the same time, in Christian mythology and Christian theology, we have the rebirth, and death is here, but we have a chance through grace of becoming something more. So these different origins of sin, well, they really bring about how we might create an alternative world ourselves. So the different meanings are very different in other religions as well. So if we look at Hinduism, There is a concept of sin, but it's really related to a law of karma. So you don't sin in the same way as Christianity. Rather, what you would have is accumulation of negative and positive consequences. So you balance these things out, and um, you have actions from your past life and your future life, and all this sort of silliness. And I will say even future life, because if you think about it, the um, sort of karmic idea is that everything has already happened. So if you think about a revolving world that comes and goes in a cyclic, like sine wave condition, and repeats eternally, then in effect, not only are we being sort of positioned from our past sins, but we must be from our future sins. Um, Buddhism, on the other hand, is a little bit different. Sin is not an act against God, but rather a result of ignorance. Um, it's an attachment to worldly desires. So, in Buddhist sort of theology, sin is really embracing the world as it is, which is very different. I mean, this is a stark contrast between the two theologies. If you read, in particular, some stories such as Paradise Lost, Paradise Found, you then also further delve into the concept of the world here. So in Milton's work, he's really looking at um, heaven, earth, sort of the realm of pandemonium, all being places. They're not spiritual in the same way that a Buddhist would see them. They're not another worldly. There might be a better world, but there's still a world. And the reality is something that still embraces us. You were saying? Or, no? So, anyway, the concept of sin then generally has the idea of human actions having consequences, both in this life and an afterlife, or future lives, or beyond. And thus, we have responsibility to act in accordance with moral and ethical principles. This has been argued by other later philosophers, such as Nietzsche, with the concept of God being dead, not to necessarily argue God is dead, but looking at how what we're really experiencing is a world post morality, where we get past the idea of sin. So, in looking at how we see all of this, we now come into the idea of redemption. And redemption, um, well, it takes sin and allows us to be saved or rescued. Uh, those wrongdoings, the negative consequences of what we've seen, uh, can now be expunged. So many religions embrace this, not just, of course, the Abrahamic religions, but we're looking at something linked to salvation. We're looking at the attainment of spiritual liberation and freedom from the effects of sin. In Buddhism, of course, we're again going into freedom from this world, rather than a cycle of rebirth, as we see in the concept of nirvana and Hindu religion. It is the leaving of this universe and going away, as the concept of the Buddha. Um, so in Christianity, it's grace through faith, faith just in Jesus, and acceptance of the sacrifice made. So we then sort of reconcile with God by understanding that, yes, we've done wrong and we can learn. So other religious traditions understand redemption differently. Judaic religion, again, is seeing redemption as associated with liberation of the Jewish people from slavery. It's the escape, the despair, the move out of Egypt into sort of moving into their own culture again. So from this, Judaic and Hebrew culture sees redemption of all humanity through the coming of the Messiah. Of course, Christianity saw Christ as the Messiah, but um, Hebrew religion sees that, well, believes that the Messiah will still come and it will free all of humanity, bringing us into a new place. Buddhist redemption, as I said, is the attainment of enlightenment. That's the liberation from the cycles of rebirth and suffering. Um, I don't actually believe in that myself, but all to their own. So the concept of redemption is one of the key aspects of many spiritualities, religious and theological traditions. It is the possibility of liberation from the effects of sin and wrongdoing, and the ability to attain purity or perfection. In our story, the creation of Adam from earth, again, remember clay, has been interpreted as how we have a relationship with the natural world, and overall how this natural relationship enables us to move from humble origins into human agency and free will. It is Eve thus moving us out of something else. So imagine now um, the philosophical perspectives of some of the Jewish philosophers like Moses Maimonides. He really took the question of human free will and moral responsibility as something very important. Um, Imagine now Moses Maimonides talking about Adam and Eve and thinking about human free will and moral responsibility. Taking that and embracing sort of a story where um, what we're looking at now is a choice. Do we obey or disobey God's commandment? And by disobeying the commandment to eat from the tree of knowledge of good and evil, Adam and Eve exercise free will. They choose to eat from the tree. This, of course, results in expulsion. It's a necessary part. We now have to labor, we have to work, we have to develop. And as we do this, we learn what sin is, we learn what death is, we learn all of these things. So the importance of human agency is developed, and the consequences of our choice is something that we now know. We also understand the need for repentance and atonement. This was common within Hebrew culture. We have the idea of the scapegoat, basically where it takes the sins of the people away. And um God chooses Moses, for instance, to lead the Israelites out of slavery in Egypt and to receive the Ten Commandments. Now, this serves as their future moral code. This is the foundation of the theology of the Jewish people, and the story here emphasizes moral responsibility and obedience to God's commandments, not the single one that we had at the beginning, but now the new one with a covenant of God's people. So as we look at later redemption and the liberation through faith and right action, we start to see the growing importance of free will. And this is a key aspect of Western culture. It sort of is part of what ends up differentiating ourselves from many other sort of cultures through history. And as we have learned to embrace all of the changes, we also understand that it's misguided, flawed, and uh, only through repentance can we return to the divine. We need to remember that free will is itself never perfect. It is enabling, but it is something where we need to logically and emotionally think through different aspects of what's happening. And because of the choices of Adam and Eve, we now have the choices we make ourselves. Over time, um, well, we have capacity that grows. We can act good, bad, And it is on our own reasoning and emotions that we illustrate the consequences of exercising free will. So, without sufficient consideration of the potential outcomes, the implications of choices, we as humans are really still animals. So, the choice of Eve led to the introduction of sin and death, but equally, it taught a moral lesson of the importance of how we exercise free will, that we are responsible for our actions and we need to act thoughtfully. So while we may not make perfect choices, we can strive to use our reason, we can strive to develop ourselves, and we can grow as people. And these choices are what make us human. And from this, we can choose redemption and reconciliation, both with ourselves and with a higher power. So the choices we make then provide a profound impact on not only our lives and those around us, but enable small decisions that have major life consequences. So if we think about this, this is a very small decision. Do I eat an apple? I mean, if you don't know the consequences of doing this, if you haven't gained the wisdom that is part of humanity now through eating an apple, the one that gives us the choice of good and evil, if we don't know good and evil, if we only, like an animal, act, well, based on instinct, then we never grow beyond the boundaries that we have. If we think now for a second about a dog, dogs show sort of a contrite attitude when they get in trouble. And the next thing they do is you walk out of the room and they go back and do it again. And then they smile at you going, did I do something wrong? Again. And they never remember. And they don't, I mean, that's animals. But we are different. We have the ability to feel that sense of responsibility towards ourselves and others. So at the heart of this story really is not just disobeying, but more than the source of suffering, the source of growth. So while it is a rupture in the relationship between humanity and God, Eve creates consequences that are far reaching in many other ways. It is us as a species now embracing the consequences of free will. This choice is something that we need to live with, where we're not acting like animals anymore. We're not able to avoid the responsibility that we have. And the narrative is multifaceted. It's a narrative that speaks on the fundamental questions of the human condition. It's complex. And who are we? So we develop ourselves over time. And ironically, one of the best analyses of this was actually done by Monty Python. I know that sounds strange, but the meaning of life, when there's a discussion about, like, with business, the business people ask about all these things, and of course, they go into all of this and they talk about all these options and say that people don't often get there because they're distracted. They go into other aspects of life. And then, of course, one of the business people puts up his hand and goes, yeah, I understand, but that thing about hats. And of course, they get distracted. And as they're discussing the meaning of life and how we can develop ourselves into wholeness and restoration, they start talking about hats again. And then, of course, the corporate raiders come in and take over, but that's life. So we live in a world where we are not whole. We're separated from divinity, and that makes us something different. But in being separated from divinity, we have the choice to labor and grow. not just to moan about things, but to enhance what we are, to accept the profound consequences that having freedom to choose mean. So, in doing this, it is how we then construct something more. So, by embracing knowledge of the separation from divinity, Adam and Eve created opportunities for humanity to embrace challenge and free will. So it's this aspect of free will that is again important. It doesn't mean we can do everything. We have no way of changing the nature of the fundamental universe. We can't just jump into a different room through a wall. We can't go through any of that. But well, rather than bemoaning our separation of God, we can view it as an opportunity to embrace the human experience in the whole, the challenges, the hardships, the opportunity, and grow from it. It is this exercise of free will that gives us the ability to shape our own lives and contribute positively to the world. It is what accepts, well, makes us different from animals and takes us into a realm where we can become something more, not divine ourselves, but learn how we can again join with divinity and a better future for ourselves and everyone around us. So then we have the nature of gender and the question about how the relationship of men and women developed. If we were started with Adam being genderless, then gender itself cannot be the defining characteristic of humanity. While I don't want to sort of sound like someone woke or anything like this, unfortunately, there are aspects of what I've written that could be taken out of place these days. But the story here of gender is experienced in many religions. So gender is an important aspect of human identity. It's how we shape our experiences. We don't get to choose who we are, contrary to what many people want. Despite having operations, we still have an X and Y or an XX chromosome, and that helps develop a sense of self. Abandoning that, well, it changes who we are. Now, that doesn't mean we need to form a role. It doesn't mean that the man goes out to work and the woman stays at home. Rather, it suggests that it's beyond our defining characteristic of who we are as humanity, but it is a secondary characteristic that emerges both from our biological and sociological development. And in the story of Adam and Eve, it's a metaphorical and symbolic narrative that enables us to explain the differences in our roles in human origin. So when we approach gender in this sort of analysis, we're critically analyzing a perspective of life that is taking into account both the diverse cultural and sociological context and changes that have occurred through different societies. And those aspects of gender here, the differences between men and women are complex. And while the story of Adam and Eve doesn't give us a definitive answer, it gives us the foundation to start questioning and developing insights into the human experience. We can look at the challenges that have been created. Again, like the Greco-Roman, maybe, I mean, it's an idea that we're one and we have separated ourselves. So in how we view gender, we also have to think about what role that plays. So it's up to the readers to make their own mind based on evidence and go from there. Now, the Jewish texts hold very different views of women. Some are not so negative, and there are many positive Jewish texts, including the Hebrew Bible, that portray women as strong and virtuous figures. So if we think about this, Christianity also has a complex, multifaceted view of women throughout history. There's not just one way of looking at this. Um, there are aspects of the feminine gender roles being important in Jewish history and celebrated individuals, people who are celebrated for their intelligence, bravery, devotion to God. The story of Esther is one of the major ones in Jewish history. It goes over a young Jewish woman who risked her life to save people from basically something that would destroy the Jewish race, a genocide of the past. Book of Ruth. Um, it's a story of a Moabite woman who converted to being a Jew and became the ancestor of King David. The Song of Songs celebrates women, and a woman in particular who is referenced for her beauty, wisdom, and passionate love for her husband, her devotion to all things that um, made her a good wife. And we also see other examples of, like from scholars such as the Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, and I hate saying these, that my forgive my mispronunciation, who was a leading Jewish scholar in the first century CE, who declared that his own teacher was his mother, indicating the high regard for which he held women and how he saw her as not only a spiritual sort of leader, but intellectually superior to many people that he'd argued. So uh, further, other Jewish texts look at patriarchal and male-dominated aspects of society, but this changes across time. So as we look at the diverse ranges of what has happened, we have to remember that there are many positive examples, um, such as the Book of Ruth, where women are upheld and uh, demonstrated to be strong and able aspects of society. Now, is this also comes across in many aspects of Christianity. So it's not just the idea of sin and suffering, but the sort of development of where we are as a people. So, um, Book of Ruth really enables us to see an independent woman using her intelligence and courage. She now finds a place in a new community and gives themes of loyalty, family, redemption that have been interpreted many ways in both Christianity and the Judaic religion. So, um, while we can say that Genesis singles out woman as the beginning of evil, as I'll say, it's also the beginning of free will. So some of us will say we have to work, we have to labor. But personally, I don't see that as bad. I mean, I'm a bit strange that way, but I mean, I was up at 6 this morning working, and I'll finish when we finish here, and then spend some time with my wife, have a couple sort of walks during the day to um, bond with her and that sort of stuff. But I work 7 days a week and I love work. So some of us are crazy um, sort of people who like work, and others, oops, are not. Now, the Midrash is another set of Jewish texts. Um, these are interpretations that held Eve in both positive and empowering ways, but also have many negative stereotypes and biases. If we look at these works, there are collections of poetry. Um, we have some of them celebrating Eve's intelligence, creativity, and resourcefulness, um, noting that Eve played an important role in the creation and development of human society. Because remember, it's not just the garden and then it all ends, but it's then moving out and creating a society with children. Um, but of course, we need to imagine that there's more to society than Adam and Eve, of course, because if they have two boys and no girls and nothing else, then there's a problem. Um, so some of the midrashic texts have Eve responsible for sin. So the different authors will always have a different approach. So we can't just take the reading of one individual and say that that's everything. When we're looking at something like the Midrash and the Jewish text on Eve, then what we need to enable is looking at the different poems, the different stories, and look at the historical context in which they were written and the different perspectives of their authors. So that stereotype will vary. Now, um, if you read enough of these texts, you'll see Eve has a role as a partner in many equal to Adam. She's celebrated, and Eve was created from Adam's side rather than his head or foot to indicate her equality with him. So this is an interesting aspect that isn't really covered in biblical genesis of Christianity. Many of the Midrash Rabbah argue that, well, instead of Adam's head, instead of Adam's foot, the rib was selected because its center, and thus the woman was equal to Adam rather than being different. So that's something people don't think about a lot either. So that part of Eve's sort of development from the midrashic text is, well, because there are many that took up a patriarchal sort of male-dominated aspect of how the early Hebrew society changed. And because of those sort of stereotypes, we see them today. We can argue that these beliefs are how everyone thought, but it's not. So there are also Jewish feminist scholars who reinterpret many of the traditional texts and teachings, looking at these not as necessarily how they've been interpreted over time, but, oops, where'd I go? But as a way of, well, examining things from different rituals and practices. So if you think about the Jewish culture that has developed, we have more than one. Hasidic Jews are very different to some of the more secular forms of Judaic religion, and different groups have a different interpretation of all this. Unfortunately, some reinterpret these very differently. Now, as we're getting towards the conclusion here, remember that, again, what we're looking at is sort of not just a justification of patriarchal structures designed for the subjugation of women, but a variety of different ways of looking at the same story. We can have multiple interpretations, as I've been saying. It rather than saying everyone's Adam's first and then Eve, there are also interpretations that have Eve equal to Adam. It's more than just sort of blaming everything. It's the, of course, me being me. There's an economic sunk cost theory and chucked in there. I think I got told by my supervisor that I'm the first person that ever added economics to theology that he's ever met. I'm sure there are others, but of course, I had to chuck in sunk cost fallacy and investment in the course of the action, even when with benefits, but um, that's just me. There's also the halo effect. You get the positive. I mean, this is a psychological aspect of, hey, there's this shiny new guy. He's talking to us, the serpent. We have positive and like, maybe I should trust him. Maybe it's against their better judgment. But if we think about this for a moment, if you don't have a concept of good and evil, if you haven't eaten of the Adam and Eve changing tree yet, how do you really know? So, what I want you to think about at the end of this is before eating the fruit, before you know that it's bad, how do you actually know that it's bad? I mean, this is the dichotomy that people don't seem to spend a lot of time on. Prior to eating from the tree, Adam and Eve didn't know that it was bad. They had no knowledge of good and evil. So, do we really want to blame Eve for something she couldn't understand? So, in deciding what to do, she had to do it not on the knowledge she's gained after eating from the tree, but the interpretation of what is good and evil when I have never experienced the concept of good or evil. So, um, so in what we're really wanting to do and reflecting on this, what we're trying to do is think about how to understand and challenge ourselves and grow. How do we grow in comprehension? How do we grow in compassion and knowledge? And do we understand really what is there and how to develop ourselves into something more? So we've been given this gift as humans. We have now the ability to question, to judge, to form, not going, oh, judgment's all wrong. I mean, the whole concept of judge not least thee be judged doesn't mean we don't judge. It means we need to adduce arguments as to why this is good or bad and understand that if we do choose to act against something, which we should at times, there are choices we need to make, then we need to actually know that we will be weighed up for our own decisions. That's really what it comes down to. Like the Egyptians with Horus and going down there and having our actions, our soul measured against the weight of a feather, we should try and be light-hearted and accept what is out there. So um, that's really it for up till question time. What do we have for questions, if any?
Is
Yes,
this
I have a Diddy putting up a finger.
okay? So is this where the concept of forgiveness comes from then? Is basically because we don't know, they don't know what is good and bad. So therefore, how can you punish someone when they don't even know that they're doing something bad? And then law kind of, in modern day
Mhm.
law, well, they would say, well, it doesn't really matter that you don't know that that was against the law. We're going to punish you anyway. But actually, like you say, in Christian, well, she didn't know it was bad. So how can you punish somebody for doing something that they didn't even know was wrong in the first place? And that's
Well,
where forgiveness
I
comes
mean,
from.
there's multiple aspects of the law, though, of course. I mean, if you're um, unable to comprehend your own actions, maybe mentally defective or something like this, um, then you may still need to be kept away from society.
But is that not what Eve was doing by the sheer, action of
Well,
eating
Adam and
from
her
the
were
tree of
society, though.
knowledge?
I mean, she's not isolated from society. She is part of it. Um, but another way of looking at this is we are innocent as children. We run round, we play, we have no cares, we fail to understand. And as we get older, we start to learn and develop and become part of something more, and we understand the need for work, the need for growth, the need for doing things. And
Is,
some of us embrace that. Some of us seek to constantly learn. Some of us just decide to um, smoke a joint and play Xbox and eat Cheetos all day.
is that not
And
another kind of thing though? We don't actually know how old Adam and Eve actually are until it comes to the point where they have Cain and Abel and Seth, and then there's an age put onto them. So how old are Adam and Eve? Are they, they are are they adults or are they actually children in this?
Well, they would likely be young adults. I mean, it talks about realizing a sexual awakening, especially if you look at later works such as Milton's. But through some of these Judaic and Kabbalic texts that I've mentioned, they go into far more detail. So um, likelihood is 13, 14-year-old.
Which would be considered as a child still. But yeah, yeah, okay.
For us, yes,
Yeah,
but
yeah,
then
yeah,
if you go back to Jewish culture, 13 was the time you turn into an adult.
yeah, yeah,
And
exactly.
again, most of human history, because we didn't live that long. If you have a life expectancy of 30, then you're not going to wait till you're 28 to get married.
Hmm. I have a bit of, well, actually, I can see Joel's got his hand up. Joel, sorry, Joel, did you have something to? I don't know.
Yeah, I like right a kind of question about the whole. It's two questions joined together. Why is it bad for the eating of the apple? Is it bad because God said so, or is it bad because there's the knowledge of good and evil? And the second part of my question, which goes with it, is if we have a knowledge of good and evil, isn't it then we can choose to do good instead of evil? And then it provides us the choice. Otherwise, aren't humans without the knowledge just going to do good or evil? And just like you were saying, talking about the
But
animals
is it
earlier.
good or evil? I mean, if you think about animals, um, a pack of wolves, are they good or evil? If you're a deer being hunted by a pack of wolves, you're probably not going to be terribly happy, but it's a natural process. So, um, it's just how life works. So that's something very different to our state. If, on the other hand, you consider people hunting someone for sport, people hunting people not good, we can understand a difference. Now, you could argue that animals, I mean, I know people who argue animals don't hunt for sport. I used to own cats. They do. I
Hmm.
mean, cats go out there and will
Hmm.
kill things just for the sake of killing things because they enjoy killing things. I mean, but is that good or evil? No, it's just their nature. They like to practice, and they practice by basically going out and finding a bird and dragging it and sticking it on your pillow.
So
As you
really, the
Which
knowledge. Oh, sorry, you go, Joel.
no, I mean that just I feel that kind of supports my thought of like it's better to know good or evil than
Mm.
not to, because then you can act to be good rather
Yep.
than just doing whatever. And
It becomes a choice.
Mm. I
yeah,
agree.
yeah.
Mm.
Sorry, back to you, Brendan.
One thing with the notes and things, as much as I can, I'm trying to update my chapter to add the DOIs so that people can find any of these works easier. Unfortunately, as you'll probably see, half of them still don't have DOIs. It's because um, they're old and it's actually harder than it should be. Not all of them have them. Unfortunately, not everything's updated to have DOIs from the past. Some of them have, but yeah, it's annoying.
Right.
But
I was wondering, Craig. I find it very interesting that in all of these different stories and interpretations that we have, some of them paint the woman in the story as kind of wrong, as the bringer of evil. Are there any that paint that sort of look at it more as that she sort of led us into knowledge and really was on the front foot of discovering free will and of and seeing that as a positive thing, because it's either that they're equal, and Adam and Eve are equal, and she's sort of opened this up, or that she is wrong in doing that. Does anyone sort of look at it as, well, actually, no, she was right to do this and to discover this path and to create within us the ability to make our own choices?
Aquinas has gone into the nature of gender and the way that women have a role in society. But the Midrash texts I talked about also document that. So Aquinas, of course, being a Catholic theologian and philosopher, believed that women were equal to men, but that there were differences in roles and responsibilities. So the way he would address it is men and women are both different because, for instance, men can't breastfeed. I know that's a shock in our modern society, but we don't. I mean, maybe technology will fix that, but I hope not. The way that Aquinas would argue this would be that men and women had different but complementary roles in society. So each gender had a unique set of virtues and strengths that contributed to the common good. So men were better suited to public and political life, while women were better suited to family, home, sort of areas where compassion was needed, etc. That's a bit different now. I mean, and I'd certainly say that Margaret Thatcher was probably a better Conservative PM than Boris ever hoped to be. But so Aquinas talked about how women were capable of exercising virtue to a deep level, that they contributed to making a just society, that they would be, I mean, look at Hildegard of Bingen as a example, but they have intellectual values and can have leadership roles, but while he was saying that in religious communities, he was also saying that they, well, don't make good soldiers, which is probably a good thing at times. So even then, his ideas have been subject to criticism and revision. But I like the complementary roles and strengths. I mean, I certainly see that. I mean, I have different roles in my household with my wife. It's not because we sit there and go, you will do this, I will do that, but because, well, my wife is certainly better than I am at dealing with other people, so she does those.
Right. Okay. Thanks.
All right. Okay.
All right. Any other questions? Otherwise, I think, Craig,
I'll let you have a bit of a chat yourselves.
Wrap it up. Yeah.
All right.
Thank you, Craig.
Thank you very much, Craig. Hope you had a nice weekend.
No problem. You too.
Thank you.
Catch you soon.
See you soon.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.